So just before I move to the next topic, can I just note a couple of matters? Firstly, you asked whether the minutes of that meeting in August 1977 were produced by the Scottish Home and Health Department or the DHSS. Thanks to the diligent efforts of those sitting behind me, it looks as though they were, regardless of who produced the first draft, they were agreed minutes. And there is some evidence that might make it more likely that they were produced by SHHD rather than DHSS, so completely contrary to what I said. But I'll confirm the position tomorrow. The second point is Dr. Foster, in one of his earlier answers when I was asking him about UK HCDO, referred to the fact that it might have been useful to see UK HCDO minutes because of a reference to Baxter's work. We found a couple of sets of minutes which contain some reference to the heat treatment work being undertaken. We'll provide those to Dr. Foster overnight, and no doubt he'll be able to confirm tomorrow if that's what he had in mind, or whether it's some other set of minutes, in which case we'll continue looking.
And let me say now and straight away that if you wish to consult or chat to anyone about those particular documents, by all means feel free to do so.
I can tell you now what it was I was referring to.
By all means.
It was the formulation of their product. There was an additive that they used which allowed them the product to tolerate heat treatment, and that information was in those minutes. And I made that discovery independently, but it would have been nice to have had access to that information.
Well, in any event, we'll supply you with the minutes that we found overnight, and you can let me know if that's the particular document you had in mind or not. So I'm going to ask you now, Dr. Foster, about your developing knowledge in relation to AIDS. Your attendance at 2 international conferences in Stockholm in 1983 and some memos you produced as a result, and then some correspondence that you had, some correspondence that took place with the ASTMS union in which you had a role to play after behind the scenes. So those are the issues I'm going to explore with you today. If we go to one of your written statements to the Penrose inquiry first, PRSE 00000545, please. And if we can pick it up at page 6. Thank you. The penultimate paragraph under the heading 1981. You say you first became aware of AIDS from a TV programme in late 1981 in which a strange illness amongst homosexual men in the USA was described. Cause of the illness not known, use of recreational drugs by homosexual men was put forward as the most likely cause. So just showing you that as a reminder, that's what you've said to the Penrose inquiry was your first knowledge. Does that remain your recollection?
It does, yes.
Now, you then, if we're going to have to switch between various different documents, I'm afraid. If we go to your statement to this inquiry, WITN 6914001, and if we go to page 46, if we pick it up under the heading HIV/AIDS, you say this: I believe that fractionators would have known from the 16th of July 1982 issue of MMWR that 3 people with haemophilia in the USA had been diagnosed with PCP, 2 of whom had died. Now, as I understand it, reading this combined with your Penrose statement, you yourself did not see this particular edition of the MMWR immediately. But your observation here is that it would have been available to fractionators.
Yes, I think I probably would have seen it as well. I mean, it took a bit of time to come, but we subscribed to that, so I would have seen it. But I knew about it before this because I was at the conference in Budapest where it was announced.
Well, in that case, we can leave aside the question of whether or not you did read the MMWR, and I think perhaps just go then to the Congress in Budapest. So what you said in your statement to the Penrose inquiry was that reference was made to those 3 cases in the course of the Congress. Do you have any further recollection of how that information was disseminated, or what the response or reaction was?
Yes. I, as you've indicated, I was aware of the condition of AIDS when I attended that conference. And so when it was announced that there were 3 hemophiliacs who had been diagnosed with this syndrome, I was expecting a discussion, and I was quite taken aback when everyone stood up and left the room. And that seemed to me to indicate that there must have been a belief that these men were gay, and people didn't want to talk about it because homosexuality in those days wasn't as considered in the same way as it is today.
So there was no discussion at that Congress in Budapest which was a Congress of the International Society of Haematology and the International Society of Blood Transfusion. There was no discussion at that Congress about the potential implications of the MMWR information for blood and blood products.
No, I think the Congress preceded the publication of MMWR, or it maybe just about coincided with it. But that was certainly the first point of contact for me, the first I heard of it.
And then if we continue with it chronologically, if we go back to PRSE 0000545, and we go to page 7, you'll see the third paragraph refers to the MMWR. That was the source of my suggestion to you that you might not have read it at the time you attended the Congress, because that's what you say here. But I don't think anything turns on that. The next paragraph is the one I wanted to ask you about. You say, in late 1982, I saw another television programme on AIDS in which a parallel was drawn with hepatitis, a comment which led me to believe that a blood-borne infectious agent was the most probable cause of the syndrome. I don't know whether you can assist us any further about what that programme was, or
it was on ITV, and it was one of these programmes about the plague in the village sort of thing. And the presenter just made this comment that all of the people who seem to be developing this syndrome are also at risk of hepatitis. And that was when my head sort of made me hair stand on end, and I thought, oh, whoa, this could be an infectious agent.
I think we next, in terms of your own involvement in matters, pick things up in March 1983. Bottom of this page, you refer to being invited by Dr. Ludlam to give a talk on progress towards development of non-infective blood products, and you say, during my presentation on the 8th of March, I referred to the possibility that AIDS might be caused by a blood-borne infectious agent. I do not remember if I commented specifically on risks associated with commercial products as opposed to UK-derived products. The presentation itself is at PRSE 0001201. PRSE 0001201. It's all going so well. Good, it still is. So we'll come back to this in more detail tomorrow in terms of viral inactivation. But if we just go, please, to page 5. There's the heading, some proposed solutions to the hepatitis problem, and then 3 proposed solutions set out, problems, and then the 4th is question mark, other infectious agents, brackets CMV, AIDS. Now that's a fairly, obviously, brief reference to AIDS. Can you recall whether there was any greater discussion than is suggested by this about that issue at this presentation in March?
No, there wasn't. But I could add one point. I mean, I have here a question mark which suggests there was still an uncertainty in my mind. And one of the reasons why there was an element of uncertainty was that Mr. Watt had been to the United States in January of that year. And when he came back, he came straight to see me, and he said he'd spent the whole day with David Aronson at the FDA, who was the top official at the FDA, who was concerned with coagulation factors. And he said they'd looked at all of the data, and he said they were convinced that this was not an infectious agent. Now, I wasn't convinced by that by any means. I thought this was wishful thinking, but maybe that might indicate why I still had that question mark in there.
Now, we know that there was a further MMWR publication in December 1982, which had referred to what has been called the San Francisco baby case. And we know also from other evidence the inquiry's heard that there was a meeting in January 1983, not a meeting in which you were involved, Dr. Foster, at London Airport, in which Dr. Krask provided an update on that and other matters. There were some other meetings in January 1983, which I don't need to trouble you with, but that was an issue being discussed at least by haemophilia clinicians to some extent. You've told us you didn't have much direct contact with haemophilia clinicians. Obviously, this presentation is an example of some contact, but do you recall there being within PFC in this early part of 1983, January, February, March, anything being raised either about the San Francisco baby case or more generally about AIDS and blood, other than what you've told us about Mr. Watt?
I don't remember it, no.
Now, if we then turn to PRSE 0001111, we're now in early May 1983, and this is a memo that you wrote to Mr. Watt and HODs, is that heads of department?
That's correct.
And we can see the subject is heat treatment of factor 8 strategy. I may need to come back to some of this tomorrow in relation to viral inactivation, but I just want to pick up here what you say about AIDS. So if we can go down the page, please, Sally. Thank you. So it says in the first paragraph, until very recently, the objective of our heat treatment programme was to cope with the hepatitis problem in haemophiliacs. And then there's a further discussion in relation to that. And then the memo continues, the possibility that another more serious infectious agent, AIDS, is now involved, suggests that we may need to review this strategy. In the new scenario, the haemophiliacs most at risk are the severes rather than the mild and moderates. There is already evidence of a panic recourse to cryoprecipitate. Can you recall what the basis was for your understanding that there was evidence of a panic recourse to cryo?
I'm afraid I can't, no.
And then, if we go a little further down the page, I just want to pick up the last 3 paragraphs or so. Timing may become crucial for a number of reasons. The publicised view that factor VIII is infectious and that there may be a long incubation period, i.e. 3 years. We may argue that this has not been proven, but hard data one way or the other could take years to achieve. Meanwhile, decisions will probably be taken according to a worst-case hypothesis. And then 2, there are some who would find a move back to cryo attractive, and if this gathers momentum, it would only need one suspected case from NHS factor VIII. We could see our fresh frozen plasma disappear overnight. It continues over the page. I'll just show you before we turn back. To you saying there may therefore be a case for accelerating our heat treatment programme, and then you go on to discuss that, and as I say, I'll come back to that. If we can go back to the previous page, bottom of the page again. Do you know what you were referring to when you talked about the publicised view that factor VIII is infectious?
I must have been referring to the concern over AIDS.
Well, in terms of the timing, this is a memo dated the 3rd of May 1983. There had been publication in the media in the Sunday papers on the 1st of May, I think.
I think
It was
there
the
might have
first,
been...
yes. So this would be a Tuesday, the 3rd, and there'd been more than one paper had published warnings about the nature of AIDS, including a reference to it being a killer transferred by blood. I forget the exact phrase.
Do you recall,
that was on the Sunday.
Yes. Do you recall whether you'd read that or whether that was what might have triggered the
It's
thought?
possible. It depends which newspaper it was. And I think there may be articles in the Lancet, but I can't remember the dates.
And then, when you say we may argue that this has not been proven, but hard data one way or another could take years to achieve, meanwhile decisions will probably be taken according to a worst-case hypothesis. do you think you were there suggesting that that the decision should be taken on the basis of the worst case hypothesis because it might take years for proof to arrive? Or were you just recording what you thought others might think?
I think both.
And then you say some who would find a move back to cryo attractive. Who did you have in mind?
I can't quite remember who that would have been, but I think perhaps the move back to cryo would be attractive because it would have a lower risk, is what I was implying.
And it might be said that the expression of here about we could see our fresh frozen plasma disappear overnight is an expression of concern more for the position of PFC than for the position of those who might be at risk of being infected. Would that be an unfair way to read this, or?
Slightly unfair. I was addressing the issues within PFC and perhaps contingency planning we would need to take in order to cope with that sort of situation, so that people would start thinking about that and not be caught unawares if it happened. Because if we lost fresh frozen plasma, we'd have to work out how to continue processing time-expired plasma, cryosupernatant, how we would provide factor 9 concentrate, which didn't come from cryoprecipitate. Those sort of details would have to be worked out.
And then can you recall, between this period and then the point in time at which you went to Stockholm for the conferences there in around July, do you recall any further discussions within PFC, perhaps in light of the fact that there had been this media publicity and the reference in the Mail on Sunday, or whichever it was, to kill blood?
Well, it was the Mail on Sunday. I'm trying to remember what the other paper was. It may have been the Observer, but I may not be right about that.
Yes, I feel like I know I ought to know, but I can't remember without checking either.
I would say I would have read the Observer. I would not have read the Mail on Sunday.
But somebody else might have drawn it to your attention in any event.
Possibly.
But in any event, do you recall now any particular conversations or levels of concern within PFC? Was there a sense growing that this was something hugely worrying?
There was a growing concern, and there was concern to accelerate our work on pasteurisation.
Now, that brings us then to your attendance at, I think it was 2 congresses in Stockholm, the World Federation of Hemophilia Congress, and then the ISTH Congress in Stockholm. Is that right?
That's correct.
But before we look at 3 documents that were produced by you at or shortly after the conference, can you tell us what you can recall about, firstly, the World Federation of Hemophilia Conference and the discussions about AIDS?
I remember there was one specific presentation by Bruce Evett from the United States, which was very well attended. Unfortunately, we were given an abstract booked with the conference, but the page for his abstract was blank. So there was no information provided ahead of time, but it was very well attended, and there was quite a lot of discussion that took place at that, which I tried to record the sense of. And
I'll come back to what you say in those documents in a moment. Do you have any recollection of a presentation by Dr. Shelby de Treek? I'm sure I pronounced that.
I don't. That doesn't mean I wasn't there, but I don't remember it.
Or of a presentation by Dr. Christine Lee?
Again, I don't remember, but it doesn't mean I wasn't there.
And can you recall, after Dr. Everett's presentation, what the reaction was amongst the attendees?
The reaction was very mixed. There were some people who thought that the situation was being exaggerated, and there were others who thought it could be really very serious.
Did you have any discussions or conversations at the conference, as far as you can recall, with any clinicians from the United Kingdom?
The only clinician I spoke to, and it was really just a very casual comment, was with Dr. Bloom, and I was at a reception standing on my own, and he came up to me and he talked about our work on pasteurisation and said how important it was, and that was all.
But there was no discussion with Professor Bloom about AIDS itself?
No.
Did you have any discussions or conversations or meetings with anyone from the Hemophilia Society, the UK-based Hemophilia Society?
No.
And do you recall whether there was any discussion about what, if any, information should be provided to patients?
I don't recall anything like that.
If we then look at the first document that you wrote, at ASTM 000039_001, please. And now if we go to the second page, there's a memo from Gordon Craig of the ASTMS of the Union. It's dated the 11th of July 1983, and he explains that he's enclosing 2 letters received from you. It says, you'll recall that this centre processes blood products in Scotland, and unlike Elstree, is an extremely modern production unit which is presently looking at substantial expansion. Peter's very well versed about developments. He consistently keeps me updated with the activities of the centre and is a very active member of ASTMS. You'll see from both letters he's very much involved in the problems associated with AIDS and how these problems could be countered. And then the last paragraph says the most recent letter written by Peter was sent direct from Stockholm where he was at an international conference on the subject. He says he's typed it up because your writing was difficult to read. If we go to the next page, this then is your letter typed up, as I understand it. I'm going to read it aloud and then ask you about it. So we can see it's sent from the hotel in Stockholm. Dear Gordon, AIDS and blood products, I have just been sitting through the latest update on AIDS and haemophilia. The following points may be of interest. 1, latest monthly returns to CDC, i.e. June, show that AIDS is still increasing exponentially. This is consistent with the view that an infectious agent is involved. 2, there are now 16 AIDS cases amongst USA Hemophiliacs. 8 have died and 5 overseas, i.e. 3 in Spain, 1 in Wales and 1 in Canada. 3, there are 2 distinct disease groups. A, those who develop Kaposi's sarcoma. B, those who develop opportunistic infections. 4, predicted mortality is Kaposi 100% in 3 to 4 years, infections 100% in 25 months. 5, haemophiliacs are in the group who develop infections rather than Kaposi sarcoma. 6, epidemiology strongly suggests a transmissible agent. Close contacts have developed AIDS, e.g. sexual partners, male and female siblings. 7, haemophiliacs with AIDS are located in areas where there is no AIDS in the community. It's still found mainly in New York, San Francisco and LA. This strengthens the association with blood products. 8, epidemiology amongst gay males strongly suggests an incubation period of 1 to 3 years. Those with the disease may be infectious at any time. 9, preliminary data from Holland and Sweden suggests that haemophiliacs in these countries who use USA products have an abnormal immunological status compared to those who've used only local products. The accuracy and relevance of those studies is contentious. Over the page 10, the USA manufacturers and USA clinicians are doing their utmost to play down the situation. It is claimed that the risk to USA haemophiliacs is only 1 in a million. Details of this calculation are not given. Current causes of mortality amongst USA haemophiliacs were listed as bleeding 36%, AIDS 11%, cancer 11%, heart disease 7%, i.e. bleeding is more serious than AIDS. 11 USA speakers also point to the fact that no AIDS cases have been reported in Germany, even though the use of American products is massive in that country. Just before I read the last 2 paragraphs, is it right to understand that what you've set out in points 1 to 11 are the points that have emerged from the presentation that you've attended?
That's right.
And then the next 2 paragraphs are your own observations. My own feeling is that with an incubation period of 1 to 3 years and the first haemophilia case only 12 months ago, we may only be seeing the first puffs of smoke from the volcano. In the UK, there is the danger that the government may use the situation to look at commercial manufacturers again. Sources tell me that the DHSS have already approached Spaywood to see what they can do. Now, if we just go back to the first page, I wanted to ask you a handful of questions arising out of this. Sorry, my fault, Sally. Page 3 of the overall document. Thank you. Was this arising out of Dr. Bruce Everett's presentation?
I think it must have, yes.
And it sounds as though you wrote this to Mr. Craig whilst it was fresh in your mind, because it refers to having just sat through the latest update. Do you know now what prompted you to want to write straight away to the union about this?
I had already been in touch with Mr. Craig because of my concerns that PFC was being underutilised, and I had believed that commercial products were being imported into the UK because BPL didn't have the capacity, and I thought PFC could assist with that. That was my initial reason for writing to him, and this was just a continuation of that.
And we'll look possibly later this afternoon, possibly tomorrow morning, at that your earlier letter to him, which I think is the previous month. In terms of transmissible agent, so paragraph 6, epidemiology strongly suggests a transmissible agent. Do you recall any more about what was being said by presumably Dr. Everett about the route of transmission?
I'm afraid not, no. I mean, I would have taken notes at the time, which is how I've managed to produce this. And those notes might still be somewhere in SNBTS, but I don't have access to them.
And then paragraph 7, which refers to haemophiliacs with AIDS being located in areas where there's no AIDS in the community, as strengthening the association with blood products. Now, as I understand it, you're there reporting what had been said rather than that being your own assertion.
Correct.
But do you recall any more about why that was said to be strengthening the association with blood products?
Because those cities were known to have communities of gay men, whereas elsewhere in the United States, the gay population wasn't as so concentrated, and that therefore, because the infections with haemophiliacs weren't in these centres, then that strengthened the idea that these were from blood products rather than from men who were gay.
And then if we just go over the page, the reference to USA manufacturers and USA clinicians doing their utmost to play down the situation. Is that you recording your impression of what Dr. Everett was saying?
No, that was my impression of what the audience were saying in the discussion afterwards.
Okay. And we might pick that up in one of the later memos when you go back to the 1 in a million point, I think. The turn of phrase you use, first puffs of smoke from the volcano, we will see another turn of phrase used in one of your other memos. Is it right to understand that, not least because of, as you say here, the issue about the incubation period and this being a relatively recent problem presenting itself, you feared that there was a much bigger problem further down the road, so that no comfort could be placed upon the fact that there were, in absolute terms, the number of reported cases were at that stage quite small?
Yes.
Let's then just look at the 2 further memos which you sent over the next few days. The first is at PRSE 0002014. This is a memo from you to Mr. Watt, 13th of July 1983. The subject here is T-cell abnormalities and haemophilia. And you say this, as a number of reports are appearing from our Scottish colleagues on this topic, it might be useful if I mention some of the key points that came out of the World Federation of Haemophilia and ICTH meetings prior to a full report. A number of presentations were given at both the World Federation of Haemophilia and ICTH subcommittee meetings. Some of the participants attempted to make the following points, and then you set out 2 points in relation to studies in terms of the T-cell ratios. And then you say this: it was clear that many European participants were implying that USA products and/or plasma were bad news. Just pausing there. Again, are you able to cast any further light? Do you have any further recollection of the discussions or contributions that have led you to make that observation?
I'm sorry, I can't remember.
Actually, before I then go on, can we just look at the very top of the screen? Sorry, we can keep the screen as it is, but the top of the page, the text. You say, as a number of reports are appearing from our Scottish colleagues on this topic, do you know what reports you were there referring to?
I think these are reports about T-cell ratios that have been published from Glasgow and Edinburgh, and the implication was that people with haemophilia had abnormal T-cell ratios as a result of the low purity of the products rather than because of some infectious agent. And therefore, people who were saying this didn't necessarily equate to infection with AIDS, because it was assumed that the patients in the UK who'd only had Scottish products would not have been infected.
And then if we go back, the sentence I just read about European participants implying USA products and plasma were bad news continues. The North American response was initially to cite Ludlam et al., but later to attack the validity of any of this data. And then you set out 4 points that were being made. Again, do you have any further recollection now, other than the points that are there set out, about what was being said regarding Dr. Ludlam's publication?
I'm afraid I can't think of any more. And I have to say that the sort of measurements that were being made by Dr. Ludlam are not my area of expertise, so I was looking at it really quite naively and just trying to give some kind of summary of what was taking place.
But then I think we get at the very bottom of this page your own input. You say, my own feeling was that there was something of an attempt to suppress AIDS hysteria. An attempt by whom? Is that a reference again to the North American response?
That's correct.
And then you continue, but as an uninformed observer, some of the more scientific criticisms of the T-cell situation did appear to make some sense. Can you recall what aspects of it you thought?
The one thing I can remember is seeing people putting up slides with a lot of data points which are very scattered, and then drawing a line of best fit. And I wasn't sure how accurate that really was in statistical terms.
And then we can pick matters up with the third document you produced in July of 1983. This is one we have looked at before, but not obviously with you, Dr. Foster. ARCH 0002544. 15th of July 1983. So this is again to Mr. Watt. And we can see you say it might be helpful if I summarise the key points concerning AIDS from the WFH and ISTH Stockholm meetings prior to a full report. Most of the information was presented by Dr. Everett. The June figures show the total number of USA confirmed cases is marginally higher than would be predicted from an exponential growth, i.e. this is consistent with the view that AIDS is a transmissible agent. And then there's a reference to cases in Haiti. 2, epidemiology strongly suggests a transmissible agent. Then there's reference to suggested stages of the disease. If we go further down the page, we can see this, again, largely overlaps with what you've already set out in your letter to Mr. Craig of the ASTMS. If we pick it up, bottom of the page, please, Sally. we can see in paragraph 7, after you've set out the confirmed cases, you've recorded other delegates seem to think that there were more cases than this outside USA, e.g. Canada, Germany, Israel, Sweden. It's possible that these have not yet been confirmed by CDC. So is that something that you were picking up from the discussions that followed the presentation, do you think, or from conversations with other delegates more generally? I'm
afraid I can't remember.
Then you refer to, at paragraph 8, to a case having been reported of a mild haemophilia B case. And then if we go over the page, paragraph 9 refers again to strong evidence for transmission by factor 8. And again, we've discussed that in the context of your letter to Mr. Craig. Paragraph 10, you say this, or you report this: common lots of factor 8 concentrates seem to be rare or non-existent. There were 2 known factor 8 lots prepared from plasma containing 2 AIDS donations. Hemophiliacs who received this material have been followed for 2 years with no sign of AIDS yet. Do you recall any particular discussion of about the significance of that?
I don't recall, no.
And then when you recorded there a bit more information about the AIDS haemophiliac in Cardiff, do you know where that came from? Was that information that had been provided by Dr. Bloom at the conference or by others?
It must have been presented at the conference, but I can't remember who presented it.
And then point 12 says, for donor screening, it was suggested that the presence of circulating immune complexes plus anti-HBC would identify 98.4% of AIDS cases. Rejection on this basis would remove 10% of all the plasma pool. Is it right to understand that was a suggestion of possible surrogate markers for AIDS?
Yes, that's correct.
Do you recall any further discussion of that issue, of that possibility of surrogate testing?
I don't know.
And then we get your impression, a concerted attempt from USA delegates to play down the situation. You refer to it being said on a number of occasions that the risk to haemophiliacs was 1 in a million, and we saw that again from your letter to Mr. Craig. And then you say this: simple arithmetic suggests 1 in 1,000. Can you remember what your thinking was about
that? Again, I can't remember, no.
And then, in terms of the US delegates who were playing down the situation, your letter to Mr. Craig, I think, had referred to clinicians and I should just check the wording. You referred to clinicians and I think USA manufacturers. Do you have any memory of which USA manufacturers had some form of representative who were at the conference who was contributing?
I'm sorry, I can't. I mean, they were all represented. I mean, it was a very busy meeting, and all the companies had delegates there. They had stalls, commercial stands, but I can't remember specifically which ones were saying this. And
then if we go to the bottom of the page, we had the puff from the volcano before. Here you've said the first haemophiliac case only 12 months ago, possible incubation period from 1 to 3 years. A number of delegates, mainly European, were clearly uneasy and felt that we may be still only seeing the tip of the iceberg. So what we saw from your letter to Dr. Craig was your own concern. Here appears to be a concern that was shared by others, by other delegates at the conference. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And what was your purpose in writing to Mr. Watt and sending this memo to you?
Well, I had been planning to write a full report, but it struck me that writing reports takes a long time, especially when you've been to 2 conferences. And so I thought I should let Mr. Watt know as soon as possible of the key points that had come out of these meetings. So I wrote these 2 memos to him. And as it was, he'd already offered his resignation. He was about to leave PFC. I was really very, very busy trying to develop a pasteurized product, and I never did write a full report of these meetings.
But if we leave aside for a moment the perhaps unfortunate timing in terms of Mr. Watt's resignation, was it your expectation that this seemingly very significant information that you'd gleaned from the conference would be circulated more widely within SNBTS.
Oh yes, that was my intention, was to provide it to Mr. Watt as soon as I could, so that he could then forward it to whoever he thought was appropriate.
Okay. And do you know what happened in that regard? Was it forwarded?
No, I'm afraid I don't.
Just before we turn away from this, I've just been reflecting upon your answer to the question about the 1 in a million and simple arithmetic suggesting 1 in 1,000. How many hemophiliacs do you suppose there are in America? In the USA?
Sorry, I can't answer that.
Well, I think it may be somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000. If so, then there being 11 cases would fit within that range. I don't know if you had something like that in mind. You were noting the number of cases that are said to have been in the hemophiliac population known to the TDC, albeit that their scope was wider than the States.
Sorry, I really can't.
You can't help.
Think that
Very
far
well.
back.
And now you referred a few moments ago to the earlier correspondence that you'd had with Mr. Craig of the ASTMS, and I want to finish today by picking up some of that correspondence. So if we could go, please, to WITN 6914017. We can see these are a number of documents relating to your correspondence with the union, which you provided to, as I understand it, provided to the Penrose inquiry. Can we go to the next page, please, Sully? This is a letter from you to Mr. Craig dated the 9th of June 1983. Was this the letter you were referring to earlier?
That's correct.
So we can see, if we go down the page, please, you set out a number of points. One, still very little known about AIDS, but there does seem to be increasing evidence that an infectious agent is involved and that this can be transmitted by blood and at least some blood products. In this situation, the use of blood or blood products from the USA and or from paid donors probably represents a higher risk than from non-USA unpaid donors. However, it should be recognised that the risk from UK unpaid donors may still represent a problem. What you say there, I think, is probably very clear, but at the risk of stating the obvious, is it right to understand that you weren't assuming that domestic products would be necessarily free from AIDS?
That's correct.
Okay, and I may want to pick that theme up with you tomorrow morning, but you continue, this balance of risks is likely to continue until non-infective products can be guaranteed either by donor screening or by treatment of the products to render them non-effective. Reference then to imported products in paragraph 3. And then you say this, picking up on what we looked at earlier in relation to the PFC. While I fully support the need for a new and enlarged NHS facility at BPL Elstree, I am very concerned that the equivalent NHS facility in Scotland, PFC Edinburgh, remains seriously underused, despite the above situation south of the border. I would estimate that the capacity, and the above situation south of the border is the importation of commercial concentrate. I would estimate that the capacity of the Scottish Centre could be increased threefold almost immediately with the introduction of shift working, and about tenfold with provision of extra warehousing, cold storage and services. Top of the next page. You then refer to your understanding that it had been decided not to utilise the Scottish Centre and resignation you thought of Mr. Dunhill. Dr. Dunhill. The Scottish Centre has been operational since 1976, and I would estimate that the policy of neglecting this facility has probably already cost the NHS about 50 million, as well as resulting in the importation of disease, hepatitis, AIDS. And then you refer in the next paragraph to work on viral inactivation and the sharing of information with your colleagues at BPL Elstree. And then if we just look at the PS below your name, You say the research on item 5, that's the viral inactivation, is not yet public, but I will be presenting much of this information at an international congress on the 5th of July. That, as I understand it, was one of the key reasons for your attendance in Stockholm.
The key reason for my attendance was that I'd been invited to present our work on continuous thawing, but I took the opportunity to submit presentations on heat treatment as well.
Now, reading that letter as a whole, would it be right to understand that you weren't really by this stage in any doubt that AIDS could be transmitted by blood and blood products?
Yes.
That's correct?
That's correct.
If we then... Sorry, actually, before I go to the next document, you're recognising, as we looked at in paragraph 2, if we just go above... Sorry, previous page, Sally, my apologies. Paragraph number 2. So you recognising there the possibility that UK volunteer donors could be infected with AIDS and transmit that through donation. Do you recall whether any consideration was given around, whether around this time or over the coming weeks or months, to any particular risks in that regard posed by Edinburgh in terms of gay population, numbers of overseas
Yes, I knew that
visitors?
Dr. McClelland was preparing a leaflet to discourage gay men from donating blood, and he was working closely with the gay community to achieve that. I was aware of that.
And then bottom of the page, please. How did you reach the conclusion that the capacity of the PFC could be increased in the way you described, so threefold almost immediately and then tenfold with the provision of the extra facilities and services you identify?
Because I've been involved in developing the continuous flow system and I understood its capacities.
If we go then, please, to page 4 of this, we can see that there's then a letter from the ASTMS's Health and Safety Officer to you, 28th of July 1983. I don't need to go through that, but if we then go to the next page, we can see you wrote to Ms. McKechnie of the ASTMS on the 5th of August 1983. I don't think I need to ask you to look at anything on the first page, but if we go over the page, if we pick it up in the second paragraph, you've referred to the potential equivalence with hepatitis B and the possibility of adopting hepatitis B type precautions. And then halfway through the paragraph, you say the very long incubation period now being proposed suggests that AIDS victims may be infectious for at least 1 year with no symptoms, for another 1 to 2 years with non-specific symptoms. And then if we ignore the next paragraph, we look at the paragraph beginning, for the UK, the critical question is how prevalent is AIDS here, or will it become? If it can be restricted to a small number of cases, it may only be a relatively minor problem. Possible that USA publicity may have checked the spread of disease in the UK. Equally possible that the incubation period is such that the disease is already with us. We should know the answer in the next 6 to 18 months. And then you go on to discuss some issues relating to viral inactivation, which I don't think I need to ask you about. In terms of the long incubation period, it appears to have been fairly clear to you what the significance of that was in terms of not placing comfort upon the relatively small number of cases that had thus far been reported. Is that right?
That's correct.
Again, do you recall any conversations you were having with colleagues at the time about the significance of the incubation period?
No, I don't recall that.
Is there any reason why that which was apparently obvious to you as a non-clinician should not have been obvious to clinicians?
I think it should have been obvious, yes.
And then if we move on to page 10, we can see here a letter from Lord Glenarthur, who we know was the minister with particular responsibility for blood and blood products, to Clive Jenkins, who was the General Secretary of the ASTMS. He is responding to a letter which Mr Jenkins had sent to Lord Trefgarne. We've looked at this letter, Dr Foster, on a number of occasions in inquiry hearings, so I can take it fairly quickly, but if we just go further down, yes, so we can see this, the first main paragraph says, I should emphasise firstly, there is no conclusive evidence that AIDS is transmitted. Nevertheless, we're taking all practicable measures. There's reference in the next paragraph to the leaflet, and then in the further paragraph to the position in relation to what was described as regulations initiated by the US Food and Drugs Administration. I'm not going to go through it in any further detail, as I say, because we've looked at it in other hearings. What I want to do then is turn to the next page. Sorry, page after that, page 12. So, is it right to understand from this that the letter from Lord Glenarthur was forwarded to you with the invitation to you to comment on it?
That's correct.
And to pick up those comments, sorry, find the right page. Yes, we need to turn to page 50. I've skipped over a number of the intervening documents, Dr Foster. They include papers that were going to be provided to the Advisory Committee on Dangerous Pathogens. And
that's correct.
Am I right in understanding that in part was the context of your correspondence with Sheila McKechnie, because she and the union were concerned about the implications for employees?
That was partly the case, yes.
So we can then pick up, and I think this probably will be the concluding document we look at today, your response to the ASTMS commenting upon Lord Glenarthur's letter. Your letter is dated the 29th of September 1983. If we pick it up in the second paragraph, you say this: I would like to comment on the letter from Lord Glenarthur to Clive Jenkins. I found the letter surprisingly complacent about the blood product situation, and there are a number of points to take up. And then you refer to the line of there being no conclusive evidence, and your comment is this: the evidence is very strong. There are now about 20 haemophiliacs with AIDS. This figure is likely to underestimate the risk because of the apparently long incubation period. Haemophiliacs in Europe are contracting AIDS in locations where the disease had not previously existed. This inquiry has examined with a number of witnesses the departmental line to take of no conclusive evidence. Other than your comment about it being about the letter as a whole being surprisingly complacent, do you have any particular observations about that particular line, which you had been asked by Ms McKechnie to comment on?
Well, it's probably true that it wasn't conclusive, but I think it was so strong that you had to take notice of it.
And then your next point relates to Lord Glenarthur's reference to the FDA regulations. Your comment: these regulations rely on the use of interviews and questionnaires to identify donors from high-risk groups. The success of this approach is unlikely to be high because of the fact that all donors are paid, and a donor who really needs the money may not be truthful. Paid donors are usually recruited from low-income groups. And then if we look at the bottom of that page, you say if AIDS continues to grow exponentially in the USA, then I would not expect the current FDA regulations to help very much. They're simply a stopgap until progress is made in screening donors or in treating products to render them non-infective. Is it right to understand from this, Dr. Foster, that for the reasons you've there set out, you didn't regard the new FDA recommendations, requirements, as providing much by way of reassurance that the products would be safe?
Yes, they're probably better than nothing at all, but they wouldn't take us very much further forward.
Now, just in terms of attempts to identify donors from high-risk groups, your observation there in the context of paid donors was that donors who really need the money may not be truthful. Would you accept that there might also be constraints upon volunteer donors within voluntary systems such as Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland in being truthful, not because of the wish to be paid, but because of the social stigma associated with potentially admitting to behaviour that would identify someone as being in a high-risk group?
I think the point about social stigma, maybe in men who hadn't come out and who didn't want to reveal this in front of their colleagues, was a sort of issue that could have happened.
I know that donor screening, donor selection was not your field of responsibility, and you were already told us you were aware of initiatives by Dr. McClelland in relation to the leaflet. Was that an issue you recall being discussed within the PFC at all? The potential limitations of the leaflet?
I can't really say. It would have been known by Mr. Watt and Dr. Perry. Whether they had any reservations or comments on that, I don't know.
And then if we just go to the next page so that we can look at the rest of this letter, your third point, commenting upon Lord Glenarthur's letter, is it seems that despite the introduction of the above regulations, we're still to carry on as before. There must be a real danger that the UK could become a dumping ground for USA companies to get rid of their non-regulated products. Was that a concern, as far as you can recall, shared by colleagues or by others within SNBTS, the fear of the UK being a dumping ground?
It wasn't, as far as I was aware, in Scotland, because as far as we were aware, there were no commercial products being used in Scotland.
And then you, in the next paragraph, or your next point, point 4, you refer to the lack of fractionation capacity and say this: the fact that the Scottish fractionation plant is substantially underused seems to be being ignored. And you refer again to how the introduction of shift working could increase capacity. And I then just ask you about the comment you make at point 5 in relation to the Hemophilia Society. So Lord Glenarthur said in his letter, the Hemophilia Society is aware of the situation, has in fact made known to me its opposition to any move to ban American Factor VIII. Your comment is, I'm not sure that the Hemophilia Society are fully aware of the UK situation, and particularly the true capacity of the Scottish Fractionation Centre and the reasons for its neglect. In my opinion, this is a scandal which deserves an inquiry in its own right. In seeking the views of users of Factor VIII, e.g. clinicians and patients, one should be aware that many users are associated with commercial companies, e.g. clinicians who act as paid consultants to the companies. Were there any particular clinicians that you had in mind in making that observation, or was that a general sense that you had?
I was aware of one clinician who Mr. Watt had shown me documents to show that he was a paid consultant. I'd heard generally from Dr. Smith and Dr. Bolton that was more prevalent amongst the haemophilia doctors, but I wasn't sure which ones.
And who was the particular clinician who was identified to you?
Dr. Jones.
Dr. Peter Jones, Newcastle. Now, you said that you weren't sure that the Haemophilia Society were truly aware of the UK situation and the position in relation to the PFC's capacity. Was any effort made either by you or, to your knowledge, by your colleagues at the PFC to make contact with the Haemophilia Society directly to explain the availability of the PFC?
I'm not sure that there was, and it might have contravened the Medicines Act because we weren't allowed to promote our products directly to patients, and that might have been seen as not being appropriate. we didn't deal directly with patients.
I'm conscious you were head of the R&D department. If there was somebody within the PFC who might be able to make an approach to the Haemophilia Society, or indeed someone within the SMBTS, who might be able to make an approach to the Haemophilia Society, perhaps not to sell particular products, but just to say, flag up the bigger picture of the PFC having capacity. Who would that have been? Would that have been a job for Mr. Watt or his successor?
Mr. Watt and Dr. Cash. I mean, it's conceivable that they did, but I can't answer whether they did or not.
So I'm going to move to another letter next. So I'm conscious of the time, and there are a few more documents and a few more questions arising out of this issue. So perhaps I could pick that up at 10 in the morning.
Yes, I think that's sensible. We'll take a break now then until the morning, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, if you please. Thank you.